My name is Enrique Desmond Arias. I am a professor of political science at the Graduate Center and the Marx Chair of Western Hemisphere Affairs at Baruch College. Welcome to the Bindler Center event, Chile's Left Turn. As a reminder to everyone present, this event is being recorded. It is part of a broader series of events that Mauricio Font, the director of the Bildner Center, asked me to organize on politics on democracy in the Western Hemisphere today. In a few weeks, and we'll be advertising this soon, we will have an event on Mexico. But today we are starting this discussion with Chile. On October 1st, 2019, the public transportation system in Santiago decided to increase metro fares. Transportation costs often make up a substantial portion of household budgets and are of particular concern in highly unequal societies where many can afford such increases, but many cannot. Indeed, increases in public transportation costs led to large-scale protests in Brazil in 2013. On October 7th of that year, high school students began fare evasion protests, recalling Chile's recent history with student protests that included the 2011 to 2013 student protests. Both of these periods occurred during administrations of the conservative president Sebastián Piñera. The Piñera government responded in 2019 with increasing efforts to maintain order in the metro system, increasing police presence and restricting station access, leading to escalation of these protests. Riots and mass arrests occurred on the 17th, and the metro was closed on the 18th. Further widening protests, President Piñera declared a state of emergency. On October 25th, millions turned out in Chile as part of a general national protest that became known later as the Estallido Social, or the social outburst. As protests broadened, they went well beyond prices and access to the metro to deal with issues related to wealth inequality and limitations imposed on political, social, and economic direction of the country under the 1980 Constitution, which was written during the dictatorship era and amended at various times during the transition to democracy and during the current republic. The Constitution includes significant reserved clauses that were supported, that supported conservative-aligned interests during the dictatorial period that ran from 1973 to 1990. On October 10th, 2019, the Piñera government announced a plebiscite on whether to reform the Constitution, and a decree for the referendum was signed on December 27th. Protests continued through 2020. The plebiscite occurred on October 25th, 2020, on the one-year anniversary of the march. 78% of voters favored establishing a Constituent Assembly. On the 15th and 16th of May 2021, Chileans elected members of the Constituent Assembly. 20% voted for the conservative Vamos por Chile, and approximately 35% voted for leftist lists, and another 16% voted for another 14% voted for a liberal list, and 8% for an independent organization supported by numerous civic leaders and academics. The result is a Constituent Assembly that favors a new constitution that is weighted somewhat to the left. Deliberations began on the 5th of July. A plebiscite is expected to take place in the third quarter of 2022 for the country to vote on approving or not the constitution drafted by the Constituent Assembly. To further complicate matters, in December 21, Chile also held presidential elections, choosing Gabriel Boric, 35-year-old member of the Convergencia Social Party, a party on the left of Chilean politics, as its new president. Boric has favored such things as pension reform, universal funding for healthcare, expansions of LGBTQ rights, and de-incarceration efforts. Today, Chile is traversing an interesting period in its political history, with the furthest left government since the early 1970s, and a Constituent Assembly that could develop a governing document that eliminates many of the reserved clauses favoring conservative interests in Chilean politics. Our panel today will discuss these issues and their implication for the future of Chilean politics and democracy. We have with us today two distinguished Chilean scholars, both from the Instituto Nacional de Asuntos Públicos at the University of Chile. The first is Claudia Heiss. She received her PhD from the New School for Social Research here in New York City. She is the head of the undergraduate program at the Instituto Nacional de Asuntos Públicos. She also is an adjunct research at the Center for Social Conflict and Cohesion and the former president of the Chilean Political Science Association and a member of its current board. She has published various articles and book chapters on constitutional change, Chilean politics, and the history of political science. Her latest book is Why Do We Need a New Constitution? Felipe Agüero received his PhD from Duke University. He is also professor at the Instituto Nacional de Asuntos Públicos. He was an associate professor at the University of Miami and Ohio State University. He has been a fellow of the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the Kellogg Institute at Notre Dame, and the North-South Center at the University of Miami. From 2007 to 2015, he was coordinator of the Human Rights Program at the Ford Foundation for the Andean region and the Southern Cone. He is co-editor of Fault Lines of Democracy in Post-Transition Latin America and author of Soldiers, Civilians, and Democracy, Post-Franco Spain in Comparative Perspective. He recently published Estado, Democracia y Fuerzas Armadas en Anales de la Universidad de Chile and La Constitución y la Derecha en Barómetro de Política y Equidad. As a reminder, this event is being recorded. We will begin with a conversation with our two panelists, and the last 45 minutes will be devoted to a question and answer. Participants in the event can submit questions to the chat box, and I will provide reminders of this as we move forward in the meeting. So the first question I'd like to ask, and I'd like to direct this initially to Professor Heiss, what is the significance of the Constituent Assembly in Chilean politics?
Well, thank you very much, Desmond, for this invitation. It's an honor for me to be here at the Bildner Center, even if by Zoom. As I told you before, I went many times in Midtown to the center and I met there many scholars studying Chile in the US, and it was a place that I really felt very close to my studies while I was in New York, and I went many times. I saw Mauricio Font there leading the meetings and met many really interesting people. So it's really a pleasure and an honor, and I feel somewhat at home. But what the process means, I think this is honestly, I think it's a sign of the maturity of Chilean politics, of the Chilean political system. We've had a very deep social crisis that I think it's very importantly due to institutional rigidity. So the social outburst, which many people said we didn't see it coming, this is completely unexpected, really was preceded by at least 10 years of extremely intense social mobilization with millions of people on the streets. We had the very notorious social student movement in 2011, and scholars know, I mean, scholarly work on social movements in Chile began in, I would say, in the mid-2000s, and by the decade of 2010, many prestigious publishers were publishing books about social movements in Chile. So to say in 2019 that nobody saw that something was going on there, I think shows the willingness really not to see what was happening, a blindness self-inflicted by our social elites. And I think a very important precedent for this debate on the institutional problems that led to this social crisis is the role of political parties. And there's a very well-known article published in 2011 by Juan Pablo Luna and David Allman, which is called Uprooted but Stable, about the political system and the political party system, claiming that political parties remained stable but had lost its roots, its social roots, its capacity of linking politics on the ground to institutional politics. And the elitization of politics in Chile, I think, was very clearly linked to very practical and to very massively rejected social problems having to do with inequality and with the lack of a social network. This is not to say that inequality increased in this period after the return to democracy. Inequality remained roughly the same. At some periods, it has even improved a little bit, but the level of debt of families increased very much. So people became less patient with the inequality and with the lack of a social network, and also became very critical of the political model that had allowed this economic system to be maintained. And so I think the constitution-making process that we're going through today, as said, is a sign of maturity, because citizens, on the one hand, had the patience not to after the outburst, which was really like proto-revolutionary, with 34 people dead, massive human rights violation, 400 people who lost their eyes, with a very intense social conflict with the police. They had the patience to trust the institutional process to make changes in this field. And on the other hand, we had a political elite which had been extremely reticent, or which did not perform this social change in the last 30 years, but which reacted with an institutional exit to the crisis that was this constitution-making process. So I think this is an encounter between an elite that has been extremely isolated and a citizenry that is extremely angry at the political system and its socioeconomic results.
Thank you, Professor Heiss. Professor Arguedo, I wanted to follow up with you on that question and maybe sharpen it a little bit. It's interesting, looking at the results of the referendum, not the referendum, but of the Constituent Assembly election, the composition of the Constituent Assembly, and how successful leftist parties were in electing members to it. So picking up on this point of kind of the separation between the traditional parties and the popular mobilization, what do you think is the significance of the composition of the Constituent Assembly?
It's a good question. Well, first of all, thank you to Professor Arias for this invitation and opportunity to have this conversation with all of you, with my colleague Claudia. And it's a real pleasure to see some old acquaintances, in my former colleague Bill Smith, Bob Kaufman, whom I hadn't seen since those Miami days, Astrid Arrarás, Peter Comlo, and so on. I think that, the significance of the way that the Constituent Assembly was made up of, is just as important as the fact that we have this process going on, which means the end of the reign of the 1980 authoritarian constitution that, although it went through numerous reforms, the main architecture of it is still the legacy of Pinochet. This is what we currently have today, and the Constituent Assembly means the end, the definite end of that. Now, this is not just any Constituent Assembly, at least in terms of what used to be the elections in the Chilean standards of the past 30 years. This one is particular in the sense that it's not so much an assembly made up of the traditional parties, which really started to die down and to have lesser. This is part of the crisis that gave rise to the movement of 2019 and to the Constituent Assembly itself. That is, parties were weakened, were not representative, were not the expression of the new mood, of the new feelings of large masses of the population. And this managed to make itself part of this new assembly. There was a debate whether this assembly would be made up only of party representatives, would have shrunk its representativeness enormously. And it was forced in a way to allow for the participation of independent candidates. And then that opened the way for an outburst of participation that expressed completely new constituencies, new areas of the population that marked primarily the presence of local interests, of regional interest, this new term that is now widely used of the territories. The territories are now part and present in the Constituent Assembly. And in a way, many of what has become part of the difficulties seen especially by the traditional elites and the traditional parties in terms of the workings of the Constituent Assembly is the result of this assembly being made up of activists. These are not people that were part of parties that were used to negotiations and this and that. These are activists, people that had single issue agendas that were very good at that, very talented at that, and the assembly was an opportunity at last to give a voice to those voices that were, invisible, unheard of, and the expression of very deep concerns in the localities. So the assembly is in a way a dialogue between these new representatives that are mainly activists and older elites formed in the tradition of party negotiations and so on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I wanted to follow up just with one question. You made a reference to a new concept of territories in your response. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Well, I think that's interesting. When I was at the Ford Foundation in Santiago, but traveling throughout the region, I was also always impressed, particularly when traveling to Colombia, of the widespread use of the notion of territory. Whomever you spoke with in Colombia spoke in Bogota about, well, what is going on in the territories. And for me, that was a very Colombian expression that denoted a view of everything that is outside the main cities, outside the real control of the state, which in Colombia is a real issue. And it wasn't at the time the term that was used in Chile. It began to emerge with a great force as it began to, as those hidden constituencies that were not part of the representation of the traditional parties began to surface and to make themselves heard. So when you had demonstrations in the early 2010s coming from the far south, originated in issues of nature intervention or mineral projects and so on, the same in the north and other parts of the country. Well, that was the way in which the territories, which was the expression of local concerns, in Chile they became known as well as zones of sacrifice. That is, as development took place and as people portrayed this huge development, rates of growth and so on, well, underneath there were these communities and groups that were suffering in a way the consequences of that style of development, the zones of sacrifice that suffered the abuse on water resources or the pollution, the air pollution, and so on. So territory is a new concept used in Chile, but now it's completely prevalent and one that we will live with for a long time.
Wonderful, thank you, Professor Agüero. Professor Heiss, I wonder if you might want to reflect a little bit on the significance of the Constituent Assembly elections and the composition of the Assembly.
I think it's very relevant, the difference we see between the composition of the Constitutional Assembly and the Chamber of the Deputies. The parties, when the political parties agreed on a political exit to the social crisis, they gathered very late in the night, and in the early morning of November 15, almost all political parties with congressional representation approved an agreement that had 12 points, 2 pages, very, very small, but that was really you could say the mandate that has regulated the entire constitution making process. And in that agreement, one of the points was that a constitutional convention would be elected, and it would be elected with the rules of the Chamber of the Deputies, with the electoral rules that were reformed in 2015 for the Chamber of the Deputies when the binomial electoral system ceased to work. system of proportional representation. But that system was exclusively reserved to political parties. For an independent competitor, independents could not really challenge unless they were like super famous soccer players or a very, a singer or somebody with a lot of charisma. One single person could not compete with a list that adds up its votes internally following the D'Hondt formula. So the lists were reserved for political parties. And because this was a crisis very importantly against political parties, you have to think that the demand for independent participation, for non-party members' participation was so big that afterwards we had 80 independent lists competing with the political parties, 79. And some of them had names like Happy Without Political Parties and things like that. So together with the approval of these points that night on November 15, there was something called the supplementary agreement that was not written in those 2 pages. And it was a conversation within these political leaders that they needed to do something to have different rules to elect the convention than the rules for the Chamber of the Deputies, because this crisis was partly against the political elites. The possibility of having a constitutional convention composed of a half of member of Congress had less than 20% of the vote. Had a little more than 20% of the vote. 78% of the population voted for a completely elected constitutional convention because they did not want to see the traditional political actors in that convention. And so independents were allowed to form lists. They had to have some kind of programmatic unity and have a name and register in the electoral system as political parties do, but they did not need to be political parties. And this allowed to enter the convention. A very important 48 members of the convention were elected from this list. This was unexpected. Nobody predicted this result. 48 out of 155 members were elected from lists, basically coming from social movements and with people with grassroots connections. In addition to that, because of the lack of sympathy that political parties have, the lists of political parties included many, many independents. So people who did not belong to the party were candidates within that party list. So this gave us a result that only 1/3 of the convention, of the 155 convention, is composed of political parties, or political party members affiliated to parties, and 2/3 of the convention are non-political party members. Now, this needs to be nuanced a little bit. It's not that these 2/3 of the convention are really people with no political address. No? There's a very interesting work that is being done by one of our colleagues at the Institute, Antoine Maillet, studying who are these independents. And what they say in this article, Antoine and 2 other colleagues, they argue that among these 2/3 of independents, a half, more or less 1/2, are really independent. So basically coming from social movements with no political connections. But the other half have political connections, but are sort of hiding or hiding their political affiliation because of this lack of popularity of political parties, or simply have had connections with political parties, but are not officially members of the party. So we have 1/3 political, we call militantes, political party affiliated, 1/3 independent, not linked to political party or to political party structures, and 1/3 of independents with some kind of link or past relationship with political parties. In addition to that, we have the first gender parity convention in the world. This is the first time a constitution making body is half and half composed of men and women. The experiences of constitution making with more participation of women before, like Ireland or South Africa, had 30 or 40% women. This has exactly 50%. We have 77 women and 78 men. And in fact, if the gender parity correction rule had not applied, so if some people did not have to leave their seat for the other gender to enter the convention, we would have had 86 women and much less. So women gathered more votes than men, which is unprecedented. You only have to think that 2 Congresses ago, the Congress was composed of 15% women, 85% were men. So this really shows you how the rules were distorting the character of representation. And just to finish, in addition to this, we have 17 reserved seats for indigenous peoples, which have been completely marginalized from political representation in the history of Chile. This was a very hard debate. In fact, it took 1 year more than the gender parity rule to approve the reserve seats. The Congress had to pass these regulations because all of this is regulated by constitutional reforms to the 1980 Constitution. So the Constitution has not been abolished. It has been reformed to allow for this constitution-making process through different constitutional amendments. And the amendment to include the 17 reserve seats took 1 more year than the reform for gender parity. So I think it's a very important sign of the problems we have with political representation and with political parties in Chile.
So I wanted to continue along this line, kind of moving a little bit forward in the timeline of the Constituent Assembly. Professor Heiss, how do you see the document that the Constituent Assembly is producing? What are the issues that are coming up in your view?
Well, the first thing you have to say is it looks very messy so far. It's been very difficult. It's not being approved like in the order where it's going to be published. Things are approved, rejected, sent, approved in half, and then so 3 articles are approved, but the 3rd sentence is sent back to the committee, and so I think we're really seeing a creative process, very you could say spontaneous. Like something is really happening, and I think really this is what Chile needed. Chile needed to see politics working because we have seen things pre-cooked all this time. So just to say, I don't want to be unfair with the 2005 reform. The 2005 reform was an extremely important constitutional reform that allowed to demilitarize really politics in Chile. The armed forces are an incredible political role through the 2005, before the 2005 reform. But this reform was done completely in closed doors by a very limited number of political actors. This is described very in a very detailed way in a book called El Pacto, the Pact. This was a pact among left and right behind closed doors. Nobody knew what this was about, with no participation. I think, as I said, it looks very messy, but it also looks very real. And there are many, many people sitting on the table of negotiations that have not been in decision-making in politics in the last years. So I think that's a positive sign. Of course, this may have some problems with the coherence between the different articles. And just to close with a general view of where I see the new constitution going, based on the composition of the constitution-making body, I think it's going to be a constitution extremely generous in rights. So many people and many constitution makers are very concerned about encroaching social rights in the constitution. And I'm afraid that this may have the problem that Roberto Gargarella has described of recent constitutionalism in Latin America, of not addressing enough the engine room as opposed to the rights part. So the Bill of Rights will increase, but it will not necessarily be accompanied or come together with a redistribution of power enough to enforce those rights. So I think it's very important to follow the debate, not just on rights, which I also think are important, but also on issues like the system of government, decentralization, and other aspects, the gender norms that are cross-cut across the entire text, that will be very important. And I think it's going to produce important changes, but I think this constitution will take some time to be implemented. So I think it will be a general direction for society, and it will open up the debate in areas where the debate has been closed by the 1980 Constitution. And in that sense, I think it's a very positive step.
Professor Agüero, how do you see the new constitution shaping up in the Assembly?
There's something else that I wanted to add to what Claudia was saying in terms of the features of the functioning of the Assembly, and that is how transparent the process is. I mean, it's extremely transparent. I'm part of the older generation, and I remember that modelic transition in Spain that is used as a model transition for the transitions that happened in Latin America later, and that including the Chilean transition looked up to that one and actually tried to get in on its coattail, sometimes somehow illegitimately, because the Spanish transition was one of true consensus, and the transition in Chile was one in which constitution was imposed, and that ruled over the transition. But in any case, I remember that the Spanish debate in the constitution was one that was highlighted, and that one of the reasons for its success was the fact that the negotiations were secret, conducted by a small committee that brought together the different, parties and tendencies and so on. Well, this is exactly the opposite of that. Right now we can, take a break here and switch to the Constituent Assembly and watch on our, screens the debates in any of the 7 committees that are taking place right now, or a plenary session if that is what's happening right now. So it's open to the public. You can watch it on television on a daily, on the screen, on whatever source you have, also on television if you want. So it's highly transparent, and in addition, it has been very participatory. There have been there have been proposals that have come out from outside the assembly, and that the assembly has to do something with them. If they pass a certain threshold of signatures, then the Constitutional Assembly has to deal with them and reject them or approve them and so on. So that's one aspect that is also part of this process, and that adds, in a way, if you will, to this apparent messiness of the whole of the process. Also, the fact that it works from committees, and committees, 7 broad thematic committees that produce the results, and as those results happen, then they go to the plenary session, and then if approved by 2/3, then they become part of the Constitution. So we have a process of aggregation that is not very planned or rational so far. It's a result of what committees are producing. So at some point in the end, someone, the committees will have to deal with, well, let's straighten this up and see how it all makes sense together. So in a way, the feeling right now is that you have disjointed parts that are becoming a part of a whole that is not clearly visible yet. Nonetheless, there are very clear, outcomes already in terms of what's beginning to be part of the Constitution. First of all, the fact that that Chile is being now declared a regional state. What that means is regional in the sense that it's a state made up of regions, of units that are be under the nation, the state level. That regions, the provinces, and what have you, will now be central actors in the new political regime. That's a major change. Of course, all this is happening as we speak in terms of the actual shape that each one of these elements will end up looking like. This is actually, this week and this coming week are critical in the sense that many of these things that we're discussing now here will be voted by the plenary session. So many things, this debate that we're having now would be different if we had it in 10 more days, because there will be more outcomes in terms of what's happening with the Constitution. But already we know that that is a central definition, that Chile will be a state of regions in which there will be a level of decentralization that was unknown for, unseen in Chile, that has been typically, for its 200 years history, a very, very, very centralized country administratively. And in a way, what we were talking about in terms of territories, a few minutes back, has to do with the reaction against this 2 centuries of centralism. That it's a reaction to that. So that's one element that is clearly present in what will appear in the new Constitution. Another one is the definition of Chile and the Chilean political system as plurinational. that means that in this regard, finally, Chile is coming in putting itself up to date with what's already a fact in many Latin American countries. Chile is one of the only countries, or one of two countries in the region where no mention whatsoever of indigenous peoples appear in the constitution. And this is, according to the last census, a part of the population that represents about 12 to 13%, which is equivalent, if you will, to what Afro-Americans are in the United States. It's a significant part of the population that has the potential for enormous power. So in this case now, that it's a reaction in a way to centuries of invisibility, to and especially in the last decades of the inability to solve the questions and the demands coming up from indigenous peoples. Now, this will be a constitution that will affirm the plurinational and intercultural character of the Chilean state and society, and will give rights to indigenous peoples that are, in a way, a reflection of what the International Labour Organization Convention 169, to which Chile is signatory already for 14 years. So that will become, in a way, part of the Constitution. Not very new things there, but now will become part of the Constitution. And in fact, it goes a bit further than that. It goes to affirming autonomy, and many things are left undefined at this point. And some of them are not yet fully approved by the 2/3, but that's clearly another direction towards which the Constitution is going. There's also issues related to the judiciary. Many decisions are being made now in terms of what that part of the state will look like. There's a changing name. It will no longer be called Poder Judicial. It's now a Sistema de Justicia, a system of justice in terms of the instead of the judiciary, and it will be composed of two systems. One that will be, part of the indigenous jurisdiction, and another one that will be for the rest, for the non-indigenous population. It's still part of a debate, but it looks like it will all be part of what the Supreme Court will have under. So it will have a unified top level, but it will be quite differentiated in terms of its function, in the two systems. And that's an expression of this plurinational character that is being defined. And there are a number of other things coming up in regards to natural resources, the right to water. There's a big debate about the rights of nature and things of the like that are coming up. The way in which communities participate in approving, certain development projects taking part in their zones and their areas that are new. It wasn't the case before. There's also a question, for instance, things that have to do with animal rights. It's part of the same committee on environment and nature that deals with those things. Rights, animals have rights, they're sentient individuals and so on. So that will be part of the constitution as well.
Thank you very much, Professor Agüero. So turning back to Professor Heiss, I wanted to ask now, I wanted to turn more towards President Boric and his new administration. And I wanted to kind of start from the beginning of this and ask how you see the significance of the 2021 presidential election. And I think this draws somewhat on your earlier comment that the traditional political parties seem to be getting weaker, right? It was notable that the main traditional parties did not really succeed in that election. But the other significant element of that election was also that Boric on the left defeated Jose Antonio Cast, a candidate on the far right. So what's the significance of that? And what are the implications of the results of that election for Chile?
Many people, when after the first round, because we had two electoral rounds. In the first round, Cast was first and Boric was second. with small, there were many candidates, so nobody had 50% of the vote. They had much, much less. And many people, particularly in the international media, talked about the polarization in Chile. How come the one coming first is an extreme right candidate, and the one coming second is a person very much from the left? What happened to the center? What happened to the Concertación? The center is emptied. And there were many arguments saying that Chile had become polarized and that the center had disappeared. I think it's true that the political options became polarized in a way that we had not seen since 1990, since the return of democracy. But that doesn't mean necessarily that the citizenry became polarized. And I think, in fact, that there may be a process of polarization underway, but it's unfortunately, I think it's led by the leadership. It's not something that started from the citizens and was reflected by the leaders, but it's something that started in political leadership because of the incapacity to represent and because of the deficiency of the political parties. If you see the polls in Chile, most Chileans see themselves as moderate. Most people define themselves as moderate. When you see the policy proposals, even the policy proposals in the cabildos, in all the great social debate that has taken place, that has not been institutional debate, and that many of those debates will be lost because we don't have a registry of that. But many people, there were many self-organized meetings of people, and you could see there the people, the reasonableness of the arguments of the people. It was not a bunch of extreme leftists that wanted to dismantle everything that was built in the last 30 years. So the criticism had to do with changing things that are proven to be unchangeable through the political process in the last 30 years, but not with undoing everything that Chile has done so far. And so I think there's an attempt, particularly by the right-wing media, which is basically all the media in Chile, all the official media. We have some alternative media online, etc., to show the Constitutional Convention as a bunch of crazy people doing ridiculous proposals and crazy things, and also trying to show Felipe was mentioning the popular initiative of constitutional norm. We had 78 popular initiatives of constitutional norm that gathered 15,000 votes. Some of them were, in effect, things that don't make much sense, or that not necessarily need to be in the constitution, like legalizing marijuana. There were initiatives like that gathered the votes, but there were also many very reasonable proposals that made it to the convention through the popular initiative of norm. And I think what's interesting is that even there, although there are, of course, on the extremes, proposals that are very radical, both on the right, on the left and on the right, these proposals have been very quickly discarded by the convention. When a convention member proposed to suppress the separation of power, this made all the headlines in Chile, and they were saying, oh, the convention wants to suppress the separation of powers. This was one person, a very young person without political experience, a social activist, who proposed this, and this proposal went to the committee, and in the committee, the proposal had 0 votes, no vote, nobody voted to approve that proposal, but still the people get the feeling that the convention is doing crazy things. I think that the moderation that we've seen in public debate in Chile is also present in the Constitutional Convention, and unfortunately, the ones that are not showing moderation are, I think, the leaders, particularly of the right. Now, you were talking about the presidential election. It's true that I think the triumph of Boric could not exist without the constitution-making process. They go hand in hand, and with the social outburst. I think the social outburst is really the root of all this process of change. I think we also need to see and to acknowledge that José Antonio Cast, with an extreme right-wing platform, with a very anti-rights of women, anti-minorities, and very extreme anti-rights agenda, obtained 44% of the vote, which is a lot. So I think you cannot say that all of Chile wants one thing. This is not one Chile turning to the left, really. I think we have a society that is divided, as it has always been, a very plural society. The convention is also very plural. But I think there is a certain consensus, very broad, on the need for constitutional change. There is a reason why constitutional change obtained 78% of the vote in the plebiscite. It's very rare to see a plebiscite with that magnitude of that overwhelming mandate. So I think there's a consensus that political rules need to change. And I think there's also a political consensus, which is not necessarily of the left, of the need for a social network, of social protection. I think this doesn't mean that you are left-wing. If you want healthcare or access to education or good pensions, it doesn't mean that you are left-wing. It doesn't mean that you want a socialist government necessarily. So I think it's obvious by the numbers of the people that were marching on the streets, demanding dignity and demanding social rights, that those are not all of one particular political agenda. So I think social rights and more democratic political rules are a very broad consensus in society and are not an extremist agenda.
Thank you, Professor Heiss. Professor Arguedo, I wanted to continue along this line, but maybe advance the discussion temporally a little bit and ask you about how you see the government of President Boric shaping up and what significant new policy proposals he's bringing forward.
I think that the Boric government will be focused on a few things. In a way, partly because it will be waiting for the results of the new constitution that will open up new possibilities for policies. But things that will have to be undertaken at the outset by this new administration will be, first of all, tax reform. Tax reform will be, the condition for many of the programmatic interests of the new administration. Pension reform and many proposals have to do with the reduction of the work day, reductions in the work week, and so on, increase in the minimum salary, and so on, under the current very restrained economic conditions, will require a lot of new resources, and tax reform will be a priority. So, of course, tax reforms are not easy to push through, and it would require a lot of ingenuity, good planning, good design, and a lot of negotiation, particularly with a Congress that is not, completely favorable to Boric. It's basically a split half and half, as you were suggested at the outset of this conversation. So, but that will be a priority. Tax reform. Then you will have to, as I said, connected to that, address the issue of pension reform. There's already, several proposals. And I think there's a consensus or some degree of agreement. I don't like the word consensus, actually, because it overextends the implications of the level of agreement that there exists in regard to a particular issue. So there's some level of agreement in regard to what aspects of pension reform will have to take place after really very, very, very long years of debate on this issue. And this will mean, to have the individual contributions that exist today complemented by contributions by the employers and by a universal pillar, as it is called, that is, state funded, and that will amplify extend the reach of the pension system. The ability of many more people to receive at least minimum decent levels of pension. So that will be another very important focus of the administration from the out. There are two other issues, at least, that will have to gather the attention of government, which is one, immigration. Immigration is at a level of crisis in a way right now, because there are thousands of people coming in from the north, the various parts of the very diffuse frontiers, borders in the north, in the desert, that are coming from Venezuela primarily and other countries. And And that has created crisis conditions in certain cities in the north. You know, the inability of of government to respond to that, to new demands, to the infrastructure needs that come along. So this will require, you know, and actually this government has, the Piñera administration has even brought the armed forces to play a role in protection of the borders, in assisting the police and all that and so on. And this government will have, this coming government will have to make decisions in terms of whether it wants to continue to use the military in those domains or not. It's not inclined to do so, but the crisis conditions might very well impel it to accept that. And there's also the question of the conflict taking place in the south, you know, levels of violence that are now a daily occurrence in the Mapuche region in the south, and that brings together in a way the old demands from indigenous peoples, very much centered on land restitution. You know, organizations that have in a way given up negotiations to obtain what they have been demanding for a long time, and then resort to this kind of pressure, you know, burning up trucks and creating forest fires and so on and so on. Pressure of that level. And that has become more and more violent, you know, there are more people dying as a result of this events and so on. So it requires, you know, a very straightforward attention. These issues in the South combine also criminality. You know, there's drug traffic organizations that are part of this issue, you know, and all different kinds of criminal activity involving trade, illegal trade in wood and other elements, and so on. So it's a very complex situation that is confronting the demands of indigenous peoples, the demands for safety of other parts of the population, regarding the demands for land and the demands for security vis-a-vis crime and so on and so on. So this will require a lot of skill, a lot of ability, and it will concentrate for sure the attention of the government in its first year at least.
And I wanted to ask Professor Heiss the same question. How do you see the board's administration shaping up?
I agree with Felipe that immigration and the situation in the South are going to be very immediate urgencies that the government will have to deal with. And these have been dealt with by the Piñera government through states of exception. There are 2 states of exception in place right now in the country. We didn't have this kind of states of exception until the outburst of 2019. We only had, since the earthquake of 2010, the state of catastrophe for natural disasters declared. But we did not have this kind of states of exception until the 2019 outburst. And now we have not only that one, but 2 more, one in the south, one in the north, and a very, very urgent situation to handle, which would be difficult for a government that has been on the other side, let's say, of the window. The Boric government comes from the social movement, from the student movement in particular, that was challenging the authority, and now they are the authority, and they will be challenged by the indigenous groups, by the problem of immigration, and by other problems, by the students, by the other social problems that remain. And I think it's going to be a big challenge how to combine the need for public order with the respect to the right of protest and the right to express these demands, particularly for a government coming from the social movement. And I think it will also have a very, well, it was already mentioned both by you, Desmond, and by Felipe, that he will not have a parliamentary majority. So we have the classical clash of trains, and the government will not have the support of a majority in Congress to pass its reforms. And so I don't think there's a chance that it would be a terribly reformist government by itself, because it will not have the legislative majority to pass very important changes, although it will have the constitution-making process that is by itself producing important institutional change. So I think and I want to add one more problem, as if this was not enough. we've had a very expansive public expenditure cycle in the last 2 years, which is very unusual, particularly for a government of the right, right? In 2020, when the pandemic began, Piñera continued in his ideologic position against public expenditure, and the government did not provide help, social help for families. They negotiated very tightly 60,000 pesos, and they were very happy that they could manage Congress not to pass higher economic support for families after the quarantines began with the pandemic. And also, the government managed not to pass economic packages and instead started distributing boxes with food, which was incredibly ineffective, inefficient. After 1 year of that, the people didn't have what to eat, and the poverty began to be felt, and there was hunger in Chile for the first time since the 1980s. Some people don't remember already that, but in 2020, we had common pot and a soup kitchen because people didn't have to eat. And because of that, Congress was on a very strong pressure to do something for their constituents, and they approved many retirements of the pension system, which were also, this would have been impossible before the pandemic. And so people started withdrawing their own pension funds, their own private funds, to eat and to resolve immediate needs. And also they started resorting to their cesantía, to the, when you lose your job.
Unemployment.
To the unemployment insurance. The government allowed people to get the money of their unemployment or private unemployment insurance. So people started spending their own social benefits for future emergencies ahead of time, just because the government did not want to give help. What happened in 2021? Because it was an electoral year, the pendulum completely shifted and the government became extremely generous. It opened the wallet. It gave many family incomes, emergency family incomes, bonuses, and it kept spending and spending and spending until now, until its last day of government. This has created a problem now with the future foreign minister of finance. But the government is still spending, increasing public expenditure. And so I think, given the inflation scenario, I think that Boric will have no other alternative than to try to cut public spending. And so a government that comes to power with an agenda of big social reform that doesn't have a congressional majority and doesn't have the economic situation to increase public spending will cause frustration. So we'll see. So I think that he will rely mostly on the constitution-making process. I think that's his way out, that's his exit way to create long-term transformations in Chile, and we'll see if the Chilean electorate, if the Chilean people will have the patience to see this as a long-term transformation and be patient with the modest short-term transformations that I think the government will be able to perform.
So I'm going to do one more round of questions for our panelists, but I wanted to draw everyone's attention to the fact that you can ask questions via the chat box. So if anybody would like to put questions in the chat box, either directly to me or to everybody, that would be appreciated. I will begin asking those questions after we're through with this next round of discussion. So Professor Heiss, I'm going to put the same question to both of you. Professor Heiss, I wanted to follow up on this last point that you made, about President Boric using the Constituent Assembly, kind of to advance his policy. So what I wanted to ask about was, how do you see these synergies developing between the Constituent Assembly and the Boric administration?
I don't think I would phrase it as Boric using the Constituent Assembly for his purposes. I think Boric and the Constituent Assembly are the product of the same political process that is demanding political change, expansion of rights. And I think what he can do is support the constitution-making process. I think as a president, he can do things that the convention has had many problems with this presidency that did not like it. The current president did not like the constitution-making process or the constitutional convention in the first place. They've had many problems to start working. They had budgetary problems. Participation has not been as many people expected because citizen participation requires at least two things: time and money. And the convention did not have either. The convention has only 5 months to finish its work. Participation, in my opinion, has been very modest and not of the first type, not of the most efficient way, because participation, in my opinion, requires deliberation, public deliberation, and not just plebiscitary or proposals that gather signatures and go to the committees and can be rejected in 2 minutes. I think that's not the correct mechanism for a truly participatory mechanism. Unfortunately, we did not have the time and the money to have those kinds of deliberative process involving more the citizens in the convention. But I think even if it's a short time, I think the president can do things to help the convention spread its message, show what it's doing. We've had a terrible communication campaign against the convention that I think has been quite successful. And the people are prone to think bad of politicians, and convention members, even if they were not politicians, they are perceived as politicians now because they're sitting in a room negotiating rules, which is what politicians do. And so I think the government can help the convention bring this process to a more successful, the most possible successful end, given these conditions. And I think it's very probable that the new constitution will be approved, because otherwise we would remain with the 1980 constitution. And the main problem of the 1980 constitution, it's not its design, it's its rigidity. And so even if the new constitution has some design problems or things that didn't turn out so well, as long as this can be reformed by the future political process in a more democratic way, I think the people will give it its support. So I'm very optimistic that the convention will, with the support of the government, come to a good term, and then the new constitution will be approved. And then the process of implementing the new constitution will take a very long time, will involve legislative change, will involve changes in the interpretation of norms, and that's going to be a slow process. And that's where I was saying, given the impatience that we have lived through the social outburst, I think the big question is whether Chileans will have the patience and will understand that this is a long-term process, and will trust these leaders, keep working for what they have promised. So I think it's gonna be approved, the new constitution, and then the changes will begin, so to speak.
Thank you, Professor Hayes. Professor Agüero, I wanted to put the same question to you, about the synergies between the Boric administration and the Constituent Assembly, and also ask you about the prospects of passing the constitutional package. I mean, in some sense, 44% of the population voting for Cast raises questions about the prospects of moving through with, an approved document.
Yeah. Well, I in terms of the synergies, I think that's the right term to use, synergies, and no more, because there's no way that Boric can use the assembly or direct it in any way, because it's the assembly is very, very proud of its own autonomy, and it will make sure that is sustained towards the end. But the government can, as Claudia very well said, support the work of the assembly, provide the conditions for it to work properly. That's an important point. And then I think it will, if anything, the administration will have to deter any attempts of the assembly to work in the direction of short-term goals that are, instrumental for government policies right now. I think the government will have an interest that the assembly works with a sight towards the long term, and it will play a role there. And of course, as you will, in your second question, I think it will play a critical role in allowing the new constitution to be approved, to create the conditions and participating in some way in the campaign for its approval. And as you well put it, 44% of the vote for Cast, raises doubts as to the certainty of the approval of the new constitution in a referendum. It's interesting that both Claudia and I have been referring to the messiness of the process, or things of the like that may not be apparent to all of you, because it's part of a local, we're present in a context in which there's much local attack on the workings of the Constituent Assembly, ridiculing some of its debates and so on, and some of that comes from those that will go undeterred towards rejecting the new constitution in referendum. There's a huge block of people that will vote against the constitution no matter what. Not everybody in the right, because there's a segment in the right that want to be part of the future, that do not want remain tied to the past because it will complicate its electoral chances for the future. So there's a part that wants to be, that want to influence the future, no matter how little they can do right now. But that's a part of the right in the Constituent Assembly that is trying to do just that. But there's a consistent and sometimes very virulent attack against the Constituent Assembly on the part of the right, as I said, but also on the part of groups that are at the center, and that have been part of what the 30 years of the consultation or so have been, and that do not fully take into account the magnitude of the change that is implied in the outburst of 2019, and of the new mood that is taking place, the new mood and the new feeling that is taking place among the youth and these new segments of the population are being expressed in the Constitution. That is, people ridicule the plurinationalist definitions of the Constitution. They say this will weaken the state and so on. They just do not understand, many of these features. They have never been sensible to the fact that we have, a 12% of the population that have been ignored, repressed, suppressed, and so on and so on. And this comes as something completely strange. The same, when you talk about animal rights and nature and so on, but it's very much part of a new common sense, if you will, in new segments of the population, the youth, and so on. Now, of course, all this will have to confront each other, or in the various tendencies at the moment of the referendum. Part of the context and that Claudia was making reference to is the fact that just as you have an important chunk of the population that will be on the right no matter what, and with parts of it shifting perhaps towards the center at different points and so on, it's also true that there will be an important, there's a decline in the level of participation in elections. Claudia was mentioning the 78% of support for the new constitution. However, the number of people that voted were roughly over 50%. We never attained the high levels of participation that was part of the no votes against Pinochet, for instance, or the first elections as democracy was inaugurated. After that, it's been a consistent decline. So we have about 50% of the electorate voting, sometimes less. Luckily, in the last election, we had over that. So what will determine, I think, the chances of approval of the new constitution will be the ability to mobilize. First of all, the population that votes, and hopefully those that have resisted to vote. I think that it will be harder for the left to engage in that mobilization, because the right has, its constituency against the constitution. the left will not have the same support that it had at the beginning, because that's how these things happen, and because many will be not fully satisfied with now the concrete elements of articles of the new constitution. Not everything of what people wanted will be expressed there in the way they wanted. So it will be harder to mobilize. And the government then of Boric will have a huge, huge role in the mobilization of support for the new constitution if this will have to be approved. This will be approved.
Thank you, Professor Arguedo. So now we turn to the question and answer session. So we do have a question, but I wanted to remind everybody that they can submit questions to the chat box. And when you do so, I will ask them of the panelists. So the first question comes from John McAuliffe. What will the new government's political role be in the hemisphere? In particular, if the Biden administration does not invite Cuba to the Summit of the Americas as it has been for the past 2 years, will Chile attend?
Very shortly, I want to say that I see the Boric government and the Boric leadership as belonging to the democratic left, as opposed to other left-wing governments in Latin America that have not been democratic. And I think Boric has been very clear to reject those leftist governments and to say that for him, democratic procedures are more important than the left or right orientation of a government. He has condemned Venezuela, he has condemned Nicaragua, he has condemned Cuba, he has criticized the lack of liberties, and I think he's a true Democrat, completely committed to democracy. And in that sense, I think it should be seen as an ally to the Biden administration, as the Bachelet government was with Obama.
Yeah, I agree with Claudia. Clearly this is clearly a leftist government, but not one that should be put together with the non-democratic left in the rest of in other parts of the region, if they in fact deserve to be called left. It's not a Maduro supporter, not an Ortega supporter. Quite the contrary. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, that will take charge on the 11th of March. It was the head of the Human Rights Committee of the Organization of American States, and clearly critical of the Ortega administration. She oversaw that part of the Americas, and she was tremendously critical of that. So now, in regards to what it will do, particularly in regards to the invitation by Biden to the Summit of the Americas, I think the national inclination of the government will be to attend. It will make an effort to try to have everybody participate, that is, and including Cuba. I think will make an effort to make that happen. But I don't think it will make a big issue of that, to the point of not attending.
So I think the point that both of you make about Boric being a kind of a democratic socialist or a person on the left, but a Democrat perhaps first, it is an important point, and I think that's an important marker of kind of the Chilean tradition of the left in many ways. I wanted to be a little bit more explicit about that, because this is a point that is potentially interesting, which is how would you compare Boric and his incoming administration to other democratically oriented leftist governments in Latin America, such as the Workers' Party in Brazil, or in recent Chilean history, the Bachelet government?
I think he belongs to that. I think he belongs to that tradition. He's a social democratic leftist, like Lula, like Bachelet. Perhaps the difference is that he comes from the student movement, although Lula comes also from, you could say, kind of a social movement, more institutionalized. Labor has always been, the labor parties in Europe, for instance, labor has always been an institutionalized form of social organization, but also linked to formal politics. This is different. This is a different path. And he indeed comes from a different past. So I think when he started his political career, which was not too long ago, he had a much stronger anti-party attitude. I remember seeing him talk, and I think he has changed. I think that's a positive sign. I think he's a very intelligent politician, and he's willing to listen, and he's willing to change his mind. He's not a radical in the sense of holding to his principles. I mean, he has principles and he's not betraying his principles, but he acknowledges that he can be wrong. He cannot have not enough information. And in that sense, I think his position towards institutional politics and toward political parties in particular has changed a lot during his career, and particularly since he entered Congress. So I think he's a very different Boric since he entered Congress and began doing real political work, as the Boric that we saw as a student activist or as a student leader in the law school, which is when I first started following him. But I think he belongs to that tradition with some perhaps cultural differences because of his age. He's much more open in, for instance, sexual issues, sexual and gender roles. He has the cultural traits of that generation, which is different, I mean, from my generation. But I think politically, I see him as a continuation of that political tradition.
Felipe?
Yeah, I mean, yesterday, Boric, Camila Vallejo, who will be one of his most important members in the cabinet, and Giorgio Jackson, who is another member of the cabinet, went to Congress to say goodbye to Congress, where they've been for a while, and where they all came together from the student movement to being representatives in Congress. And now they went to say goodbye, which is very telling, this that I'm saying, because it shows how different this group is from the rest of the left in Latin America. This is a left that came from the student movement and that as such joined other movements that were, in a way also related to the student movement, which was, for instance, the women's movement. And in that way, they began to join forces, students and women and other social organizations that were behind pension reform, and began coalescing around larger issues, not only education, but pension reforms and so on and so on. And in the course of 10 years, they became, from the social, from student organizations to government. It's quite remarkable in terms of building a party, building a coalition, building an electoral support. So there's no, and it's quite new in this event. There's no reference to workers' movements such as Lula, right? In a way, it's closer, if you will, to Jose Mujica, although Mujica also has his roots in longer trends, of course. And as Claudia was saying, it's a very young movement. There's some people that express the youth. They act like young people. They're all tattooed. They show it. And so there's not. I'm not in favor of those that say that there is a generational cleavage in Chilean politics, which is not to say that they express a new generation at the same time. And that is clearly the case. So there are particularities in the way that this group is of the left. Also, because they're so young, some of them, and Boric in particular, is very well read. He's very cultured in a way. And he has made it a point to learn about what many in his generation had no idea about. What was really the fight against dictatorship? What was really democracy like prior to Pinochet and so on? Well, Boric has made it a point to see himself as part of a larger trend in the left, rather than just emerging out of the blue, which in fact is the case. It came out of the blue.
Especially if you weren't in Magallanes, right? Or the Santiago student movement. By the way, one of my fun stories about the Santiago student movement is Hugo Fröhling, who's at your school, invited me to give a talk in 2011 down at the University of Chile. I was giving the talk in the business school, and all the student protesters were out front. The rest of the university was shut down at the time. And during lunch, I was down eating my sandwich at lunch, and I started tasting like all this really hot pepper in my sandwich. And I was like, wow, I didn't know they ate such spicy food in Chile. And I realized they were pepper spraying students out front of the building, and it was filtering into the lunchroom where we were eating in the basement of the business school. Anyway, my story is about the Chilean student movement. I like spicy food, so this was great. It was a special bonus that I got in that sandwich that they served. Jonathan Conning asks a question. He says, as follow-up, the one traditional political party in Boric's coalition is the Communist Party. Yet Boric and the Frente Amplio seem more comfortable at times reaching out to the center left. How does Boric and the Frente Amplio position themselves to pass legislation and have their movement institutionalize, last, endure? Do you see the same coalition in a future election or new coalitions? And either of you can take that.
Well, let me jump in now, Claudia, and then you correct all my mistakes. I see that, well, I think that Boric's effort to look towards the center left is an attempt to broaden the coalition, certainly. I think he sees himself with a historic task, in a way, of adhering this new movement that is reflected in the government with the parts of the old left that want to reinvigorate itself. Of course, that is a condition. It has to reinvigorate itself. It hasn't done so, but and it will have to do so. It will continue with this coalition. But I see Boric seeing himself as having an important role in cementing a larger coalition that includes part of the old left. Of course, the communists will be there because the communists, have nowhere else to go, and they're pushing on the left and so on. But the great challenge then is how to attract in a more stable way a coalition that is broader. And I think that it would be Boric's goal, in a way, to sustain a coalition that includes at the outset, not as it happened this time with its own election, broader segments that are not part officially of the coalition that emerged. I wouldn't say going all the way to Christian Democrats, because Christian Democrats are in complete disarray, and it's very hard to know what happens with them and what are the leaderships there. They only have one member in the Constituent Assembly and so on. But of course, in terms of the electorate, they will seek also that kind of support.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, well, Hugo is Felipe's boss, and Felipe is my boss. So I think the relationship with the Communist Party, Felipe says there's no real generational cleavage here, but I think there's a very real difference between the old communists and the young communists, although some young communists are old communists, like Jadwe. I think Jadwe, even though he's young, is more similar to the old communists. Maybe it's a gender issue. I think Carol Cariola, Camila Vallejo are of a very, very completely different type of political position. And we see this clearly with regard to the condemnation of leftist governments abroad. The international policy of the Communist Party is very rigid, very strict. They side with the left no matter what they do. And Vallejo and Cariola don't. And I think there are some people in the Communist Party that are more like Euro-communists, more willing to participate in coalitional politics, to dialogue, that are not maximalist. And there are other leaders, particularly the old guard of the Communist Party, which don't have that position. And that was seen, I think, very clearly in the November 15 agreement, because the Communist Party did not sign the November 15 agreement, and Boric did. Boric signed the November 15 agreement to have a constitution-making process, against his own bases. He was not authorized by his own movement. That it was not a political party yet, but it was a movement with representation in Congress. And he decided that this was a step that Chile needed to take to have a new constitution. The communists preferred to reject this and keep their position as not negotiating with the right. And so that's a very important difference. And I think Felipe was talking about the confusion in the Christian democracy. There are very different Christian Democrats on the right part of the party and on the left part of the party. And I think the same applies for the Communist Party. Also, these are small parties. And I think Boric doesn't have a very clear support from a political party. He has a party which is also very small, but his support comes from a more abstract belonging of a political sector that is not embodied in one particular political party. So I think he has a clear position. The Communist Party is partly in that position and partly not. And that will, but I think, as Felipe was saying, that I think that he has a clear view that you cannot build reformist projects without a broad majority, and broad majorities require moderating and dialoguing with different political sectors that want change towards social rights.
So just to follow up on this, and again, either of you can take this, I wanted to ask, in terms of actually passing legislations, what type of coalition does Boric have available to him in Congress? Like, who is he going to work with? I mean, Professor Agüero went all the way up to saying, well, maybe not including the Christian Democrats, but what are the parties that he needs to get to work together to actually pass legislation?
Well, certainly in Congress, the Christian Democrats, there's no question about it.
Mm-hmm.
And the socialists, which have, members in the cabinet now. And those that are not part of the core coalition of Boric will be essential for any legislation that Boric would want to pass. And in certain issues, we'll have to go to parts of the right as well. It will need the support of elements in the right. So it will have to exert, its utmost talents, and of course with true content negotiation in order to get things through. I think they're fully aware that they have put George Jackson in charge of the cabinet position that is responsible for the relationships with Congress. Jackson is a good negotiator. He's very young as Boric, but will have the main responsibility in this regard, and he has the talents and the ability to do so, and has been displaying that so far. Now, on the other hand, the right has already expressed its intention of exerting very, very harsh opposition to the government. Now, of course, this is the way, this is politics, and they will do that, and they will try to gain from that opposition. But so I hate it's very complicated. I mean, there's no question about it. This would be very hard. It would be very hard for the government to address these critical issues that we were mentioning before, in terms of the violence in the South, in terms of immigration, in terms of social discontent that it's outlying there, sometimes expresses itself no matter what, and now government will have to come on the side of public order and so on. So it will be very difficult. In addition to that, it will have to negotiate with the right, and that will not be to the liking of many in his own coalition, but there's no choice. So, what all this goes to emphasizing a point that Claudia was making, that, there will not be major forward revolutionary reforms in this government. They will have, if they pass a good tax reform that allows the funding for many of the social aspects of the platform, that will be already a great success, and the right will be put against the hard rock not to accept many parts of what the tax reform will include.
And just to follow up on this one more time, and perhaps address this portion of it to Professor Heiss. Given the available coalition beyond tax reform, what can the Boric administration realistically pass in this Congress?
I think there are reforms that have been being debated for a very long time. So I don't think there will be a break regarding that. I think Congress will have to continue the discussion of the most pressing issues that are part of the agendas of legislators, left and right. Pension reform is a necessity. And so some kind of change in pensions will have to happen, because this is what people are asking for from all the political sides, because the pension system is untenable. And it's one of the causes of the outburst. I think the agenda that Felipe mentioned is very correct regarding priorities. But as he said, I think I don't see this government as a government that will be extremely that will produce very radical legislative change by itself. I think the change will come slowly through the new constitution and the adaptation of new laws. But I think the Congress will continue reforms that have been advanced by the social protest throughout all this time. When the right in Congress voted to approve the withdrawal of retirement funds, that was like even right-wing legislators voted against its own government, because they vote because their constituencies were watching. And so I think these social changes will continue in a very moderate way with all the political forces in Congress, not with the agenda of the president necessarily, but because Chilean society is moving in that direction. And so I see the legislative work of the new government as a moderate advancement towards social rights and the reduction of inequality without radical legislative change.
Thank you, Professor Heiss. So we have a question from Margarita Totora. She asks, will Boric introduce a new Via Chilena? How will he surpass the obstacles, for example, the Catholic Church and cultural predispositions emerging from that around sexual orientation, sexual freedoms? And either one of you can take this.
Well, Claudia, let me say this. References to a Via Chilena reminisces of old times of a Via Chilena against other vias, right? It was the Via Chilena al Socialismo of Allende vis-a-vis, the revolution, the way Che Guevara and the other armed orientations of the left at that time. And Allende was the example of something that could be done within the institutional setting. I don't think that talking about the Via Chilena, it might be interesting in terms of what that means in this new context. And I would like here to make reference because Via Chilena would be related to a way of coming out successfully of a crisis of democracy, right? Which is affecting countries all over the world, if you will. It comes to mind a talk which I recommend by Steve Levitsky that he gave in a webinar sponsored by El Mercurio, the local major newspaper here, and that it was a presentation that Levitsky made comparing the crisis of democracy in the United States and in Chile, which was very interesting in terms of different ways in which the crisis of democracy expressed itself in different ways in these two countries that were going through a crisis of democracy. And at the same time, he highlighted how things that were happening in Chile, like the Constituent Assembly and so on, were ways of perhaps of getting out of that, and in that way we can think of a Via Chilena to address the depth of the crisis that were expressed so clearly on that outburst in 2019. But I think it will be if Chile, in a way, it's putting itself up to date in terms of reforms that have taken place in other countries, in terms of making social benefits more universal, in terms of broadening gender rights, in terms of recognizing indigenous rights and so on, which on a point on which it's so far behind. Well, in this new constitution, Chile will certainly go further than other countries have gone. And because it's undergoing this debate right now, influenced by current debates and so on. And in a way, you know, just like Claudia was saying, that the government of Boric will not be as revolutionary as the constitution will be. And in a way, the Chilean process will be pulled by the constitution, because it will open the way to many new possibilities. And in this way, then perhaps you can speak of a via chilena that opens up new avenues to broadening, you know, gender rights, that shows a way to deal with harmonizing development with nature rights, animal rights, the rights of local communities, and so on. It's a very delicate balance, of course, but it might be a way out of that. Of course, there are a number of pending issues. You know, Claudia was alluding to difficulties of, you know, that Boric doesn't have a real party underneath. Well, one of the challenges ahead is how to build, you know, parties again. You know, democracy cannot exist without parties, no matter how many changes we can think that democracy can undergo. Parties are still the essence, and parties will have to be built. This realignment will have to express itself in parties, and that's a new, very challenging task going forward. So, if all that can be put in terms of a via chilena, well, that would be. But of course, via chilenas cannot be replicated, or other vias cannot replicate as easily, because it depends on the conditions elsewhere as well.
Professor Heiss, did you want to add anything to that?
I wanted to add something about sexual and reproductive rights. I think the 1980 Constitution had a very specific project of protecting neoliberalism from future change, protecting conservative values, Catholic values. It was a Catholic-inspired constitution, and nationalism against and anti-communism. Those were the values, the Cold War values that inspired Jaime Guzman and the supporters of Pinochet in the constitution. And so it had very strong provisions, and Chilean legislation, of course, going back to many years, have a very discriminatory rules that affect the equality, the gender equality, and the access of women to work and to independence. And I think that just as the new constitution is a big change on the role of on the relationship between the state and the market, gender roles will be also strongly transformed by the constitution. Not only by the constitution, as I said before, I think we have institutions that became completely divorced from social norms. This precisely Levitsky, Vicky Murillo, and Daniel Brinks wrote a book about institutions in Latin America, where they talk about the need to for a tuning between social norms and institutional norms. And I think this crisis that we're living today in Chile has to do with a complete divorce between social norms and institutional norms, and the balance of power changed completely. There was when Merike Blofield studied the conservative gender rules in Chile, particularly divorce and abortion, for example, we only had a law of divorce in 2004, very recently. And we didn't have divorce until 2004. And the abortion was only approved in 2010, only when the risk of the mother is a danger and the fetus is not viable, and on the three particular causes. There's a very restrictive abortion law only since 2018. So I think we have a sort of pendular movement where this issue was so much suppressed and so much divorced from the social perception that today we have a very strong feminist trend in the Constitutional Convention. We have a very powerful feminist movement in 2010 that changed. We've lived this with Felipe and the University of Chile. All the universities started approving abuse, sexual and gender abuse protocols, norms for equality in payment, and other issues regarding gender equality in universities, because this was also a student movement, feminist student movement. And also we have the first judicial decisions addressing intersectionality. We legalized the crime of femicide, which many advanced countries don't have the femicide as a crime. So the gender perspective on the judiciary has been applied for several years already. And all of this is present in the Constitutional Convention, which has gender equality as a transversal, as a across issues element in its constitution. So I think just to add one more thing, in this balance of power, in this book where Merike addressed the sort of backwardness of Chile compared to other countries after transition to democracy, because this is something that happened in Argentina, happened in Spain. After the dictatorships, these issues opened up. In Chile, they didn't. Chile remained much more conservative than other countries after transition. And I think, and she addressed this in relationship to the balance of power between the Catholic Church and the feminist movement. And I think that balance completely shifted, and particularly the sexual abuses within the Catholic Church, I think contributed greatly to its lack of legitimacy today. And this empowered the feminist agenda to change gender roles against the Catholic conservative perspectives. And so I think Chile has changed very, very much in very few years. And this also scares many people. This also causes a reaction. And so I think we are seeing a very rapid change in gender roles in Chile. And at the same time, we are seeing a sort of a retraction of conservative sectors that allowed for something like the José Antonio Cast agenda. José Antonio Cast said incredible things in his campaign, like that the gender ideology was worse than communism. He wanted to suppress the women's ministry and other things. And so I think this rapid change is also creating a reaction in scared groups that are more conservative and that see this as a threat to their way of understanding their way of life.
Yes, Craig?
Yeah, hi. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I've lived on and off in Chile 50 years of my life. And I'm in my home here in Las Brisas, Chicureo. And I love this country tremendously. But how is Boris going to stop this violence? It is getting out of control. I mean, last night they burned 3 buses and the carabineros don't even show up. You go out in the streets and you go downtown, there's no presence of the police, and we're just being overrun. And it's getting, it's looking more worse than Colombia. I don't know if you ask people and everyone kind of looks at the sky, and it worries me.
As someone who spent a great deal in time in Colombia, I assure you it's not worse than Colombia.
Okay, well.
But thank you for your question. If we can respond to that, it is a really significant issue. I had one additional question I wanted to ask before we left. But go ahead. Either one of you wants to take that. I think Felipe actually had addressed that most concretely earlier.
Yeah, I mean that Craig Duncan is right in terms of. I think that there's violence in the South, and of course there's rioting now much lesser level in parts of Santiago and certain days of the week that have become sort of like a regular practice. When I am in Santiago, I have to go through. I'm not in Santiago right now, but I have to go through those areas, so I'm very familiar with that. And it's very important to understand, when the Constituent Assembly met for the first time, it was gathered for the first time in Congress. And so the most extreme left forces were there. Everybody was there now in the Constituent Assembly. And so you would say that this was finally the satisfaction of the demands of the most violent groups. Well, no, there was a huge demonstration. Well, I wouldn't say huge. There was a demonstration by small groups, but very violent groups, against the Constituent Assembly. And the most radical groups went out of the Constituent Assembly because they didn't want to start the workings of the assembly if the police were suppressing that demonstration. So what they did is, well, we'll go out and take care of this. So this group came out, and what happened is that they received the stoning of these groups. They didn't want to talk with them. So there's a group out there that is, out of all streams of the political forces that are chaotic and that are what's the word for them? I'm running out of this word. They're well, I forget. They're out of there. So they're very hard to control. They're not people that can be controlled by arguments or conversation or dialogue or so on. So but we have to deal with that, and that is it requires a very artful combination of use of the powers of public order with negotiation, dialogue, and certain policies. I hope that we have the talent to do that, but it's a big challenge. I agree with that, and particularly because Boric will be inheriting the huge demand and preliminary efforts to conduct police reform. Police reform is also another aspect that the government will have to push forward and will have to address. And we know what the police does when there are these reform attempts. It strikes, right, by doing nothing. And so they will have difficult, the Concertación governments had this problem all the time, let alone this new coming government that will want to reform the police. So it will be a very, very difficult task. I agree, it's a challenge.
So I wanted to conclude the session by asking Professor Heiss and Professor Aguero if they had any final reflections they wanted to make on the historical significance of this moment for Chile. Professor Heiss?
Yes, I think that it's an undeniable historical moment. It's really the end of the legacy of the dictatorship, maybe, if the convention succeeds and the new constitution is approved. And it has to be said that the exit plebiscite, that as it has been called, the last plebiscite to ask the ratification, to ratify the new constitution, will be the only one with a mandatory vote. So there will be an economic sanction for people not voting. We haven't had mandatory votes since 2012, when the voluntary vote began. And we don't know how the electorate will behave, because we haven't had a mandatory vote for a very long time. I still think that what's happening in Chile has many difficulties, but it's overall a good thing. I think that the convention is really learning to negotiate, learning to work among themselves, and I hope that the campaign against it is not enough to make people reject the new constitution. And I think the most probable result, the most probable outcome, as I said before, will be the approval of the new constitution and the beginning of a new, much more democratic time for Chile. So I'm overall optimistic.
Thank you so much, Professor Heiss. Professor Aguero?
Yeah, thank you, Desmond, for this last opportunity. I think that the two things that I want to bring up here. One is that it comes to this nuance that Claudia was mentioning earlier, which is that, we have this strong support for reform, but we also have a distribution of forces in the political spectrum that is somewhat stable. Despite the appearance of huge shifts to the right and the left and so on, there's a lot of stability, and many factors come together to explain why it goes in one direction and not the other, which in fact brings up the possibility of backlash at a number of points in this process. So we have to bear that in mind. And despite the fact that we have a huge force behind this reformist attempt, things have to be fought over, day by day, with the best of talents, with the best instruments, with the best capacities, and so on. So everything is out there in the open still, and remains to be seen. But the second thing I want to say is precisely the magnitude of these forces. Let me plug this in because I'm running out of battery. And this is true. I mean, this truly has to be seen as a huge turning point. It's the end of an era, not only in terms of the end of a constitution, but it's also the end of a cycle of stability, maintained by a party system that no longer exists. And at the same time, new issues have come up that will be here to stay. I think it will be impossible really to go back to times in which women were not present at all times everywhere. I mean, it's still a struggle, of course. They're not in the boards of the main companies, but there's a push towards that happening. They have the largest presence in the cabinet ever. There are more than men in the cabinet. They're half in the Constituent Assembly. It will be impossible to have again a Congress that has 30% of women. So it will be impossible. So that's something that is already firmly implanted, I think, in the Chilean system. Of course, as I say, it will have to be part of a struggle, continuing struggle, but it's there. And I think that there are new sensibilities that are coming up from the localities, from the grassroots, that were not visible before, and now will be impossible to ignore. There's the indigenous question that has risen up to the top visibility, to a point that an indigenous leader chaired the Constituent Assembly in the first 6 months, and so on. There's a new way of looking at the way in which development should take place, the way in which elites should be restrained, and so on, in which gender issues and issues of sexual identity. So in a way, the acceptance of diversity in its various ways it's part of this huge shift that is taking place. Still with a lot of opposition, with a lot of resistance, with a lot of rejection particularly by older generation, I would say. So even if I say that there's no generational cleavage in terms of the cleavages we heard from lips at Rocan, there is certainly a divide that expresses young people and that goes against many of the things that older generations were for. So it's a major turning point, I would say. That's what I will conclude with.
Thank you so much, Professor Agüero and Professor Heiss, and to the audience for attending, and to Rosalina Lopez and Mauricio Font for helping organize the event. I look forward to seeing you all again soon, maybe even someday in person. Have a good afternoon.